In the moment when everyone believed a foolhardy human had risked his life to rescue a wild predator, no one suspected it was actually the moment they would welcome the newest member, a pet that the entire research vessel had never imagined possible. The year was 2437, a century after the formation of the Interstellar Alliance. The multi-species research vessel, Aurora, maintained a steady orbit around the desert planet, Athera 4. The ship's corridors buzzed with quiet tension. Most crew members were gathered in the observation deck, watching the preliminary scan results from the planet's surface with a mixture of scientific curiosity and unease. Dan Reyes, stood somewhat apart from the others, his attention fixed on the holographic display. Unlike most of the crew, who had served together for years, Dan was a recent transfer. His expertise in planetary biological specimens and previous work with domesticated predators on Earth had earned him a position aboard the prestigious vessel. But he hadn't yet found his place among the eclectic crew. "Initial biomarkers confirm life signs," announced Captain Yori Tanako, a tall human from Alpha Centauri with distinctive silver streaks in her dark hair. Her steady voice carried authority without aggression, a leadership style that had earned her respect across multiple species. "But the readings are unusual." Zalia, the ship's medical officer, leaned closer to the display. Her rabbit-like features, large reflective eyes and sensitive ears that twitched at the slightest sound, belied a brilliant, analytical mind. "The molecular signature suggests a large predatory organism, but there's something anomalous in the cellular structure." "Location?" asked Corvin, the ship's security officer. The reptilian's scales tensed as he spoke, a physical manifestation of his perpetual vigilance. Standing nearly 7 feet tall with thick, armored hide, Corvin was an imposing presence even when relaxed, which was rarely. "Northwestern Quadrant, Sector 7B, replied Mira, the sensor engineer. Her 6-fingered hands flew across the console. "It's trapped beneath a rock formation. Life signs are weakening." Dan stepped forward, studying the optical imagery more closely. Through the dust and interference, he could make out a skeletal figure with long limbs, muscular structure, and sharp spines, partially buried under collapsed rocks. "That silhouette matches the database entry for a Vorhan, doesn't it?" The mention of Vorhan sent a visible ripple of tension through the command deck. Corvin's clawed hand moved instinctively to his weapon. "Affirmative," Captain Tanako confirmed grimly. "The heat signature and skeletal structure are consistent with Vorhan morphology." Dan knew the reputation of the Vorhans, apex predators of Athera 4, responsible for the slaughter of an entire mining outpost 5 years earlier. 15 colonists had been torn apart before security forces could respond. The incident had led to a standing protocol. Any Vorhan encountered was to be considered an immediate lethal threat. "We should blast it from orbit," Corvin stated flatly. "Protocol is clear regarding Vorhan encounters." Dan frowned. "It's injured and trapped. That doesn't align with typical Vorhan behavior. They're known to hunt in packs, not venture out alone." "Perhaps it was separated from its pack," suggested Zalia, her nose twitching with nervous energy. "Regardless, the danger remains." Dan couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't adding up. During his years working with Earth's most dangerous predators, he'd learned to recognize patterns that others missed. "Captain, I'd like permission to take a closer look. The optical resolution isn't clear enough to make a proper assessment." "Absolutely not," Corvin interjected, before the captain could respond. "It's too dangerous to send anyone down there." Captain Tanako studied Dan thoughtfully. "What exactly are you proposing, Specialist Reyes?" "A short-range landing craft. I can observe from a safe distance. Use long-range scanning equipment to gather more data." Dan hesitated, then added, "And if necessary, I'm qualified to tranquilize and retrieve the specimen." The suggestion sent a wave of murmurs through the command deck. "You want to retrieve a Vorhan?" Corvin's voice rose in disbelief. Have you lost your mind? One Vorhan killed 15 trained colonists. Dan stood his ground. If it is indeed a Vorhan, then yes. I'm suggesting we study it rather than destroy it. But I'm not convinced it is. At least not entirely. The infrared signature shows anomalies. Captain Tanaka raised a hand, silencing the brewing argument. This mission is primarily scientific in nature. If there's a possibility of studying a unique specimen, we should consider it. She turned to Dan. However, I cannot authorize a retrieval mission without significant safety protocols. I'll go alone, Dan offered. Minimal risk to the crew. Minimal risk to us, perhaps, Zalia said softly. Maximum risk to you. Dan smiled at her concern. I've worked with Earth's most dangerous predators for years. I know how to approach, tranquilize, and transport them safely. After 30 minutes of heated debate, during which Corvin enumerated all the ways a Vorhan could disembowel a human, Captain Tanaka finally made her decision. Specialist Reyes, you have conditional permission to observe and assess. Landing craft will be prepared with standard scientific equipment, plus Class 4 tranquilizer systems. She fixed Dan with a stern look. But you will maintain constant communication, and at the first sign of elevated danger, you abort. Is that clear? Dan nodded, relief flooding through him. Crystal clear, Captain. As the crew dispersed to prepare for the mission, Corvin approached Dan, looming over him menacingly. If that thing wakes up while you're down there, your remains won't fill a specimen jar. I appreciate your concern, Dan replied evenly. It's not concern, Corvin growled. It's fact. Vorhans don't just kill, they hunt for sport. They're monsters. Dan had heard similar sentiments throughout his career. Predators were always monsters until you understood them. Every creature has patterns, behaviors that can be predicted and managed, even monsters. Corvin's scales rippled in what Dan had learned was a sign of disgust. Your human sentimentality will get you killed, and if you somehow manage to bring that thing aboard, it might get us all killed. With those ominous words hanging in the air, Corvin stalked away, leaving Dan to prepare for the mission. 2 hours later, Dan found himself piloting a small landing craft toward Athera for his surface. The descent was rough. Atmospheric conditions created turbulence that buffeted the small vessel. Dust storms swirled across the planet's barren landscape, reducing visibility and making landing particularly challenging. Aurora to landing craft. Captain Tanaka's voice crackled over the comm. Status report? Approaching landing zone, Dan replied, adjusting the craft's stabilizers. Visibility poor, but manageable. ETA 3 minutes. Life signs of the subject are still present but diminishing, Zalia's voice added. Whatever it is, it's growing weaker. Dan felt a familiar surge of determination. Throughout his career, he'd been driven by a simple belief. All life deserved a chance. It was what had led him to rehabilitate predators others would have destroyed without a second thought. The landing craft touched down with a jolt, kicking up a cloud of yellowish dust. Dan quickly donned his environmental suit and checked his equipment. Medical scanner, tranquilizer gun calibrated for large predators, basic first aid supplies, and a portable force field generator for emergency containment. I'm on the surface, he reported. Beginning approach to subject location. Stepping out onto Athera 4's surface felt like walking into a furnace. Even through his environmental suit, he could feel the planet's scorching heat. The landscape was desolate. Yellow-orange sands stretched to the horizon, broken only by jagged rock formations that jutted skyward like ancient teeth. Dan trudged through the loose sand, each step requiring effort. The rock formation where the life signs had been detected loomed ahead, a twisted mass of stone that had likely been shaped by the planet's fierce sandstorms. I have visual on the formation, Dan reported, approaching from downwind to minimize scent detection. Be careful, Zalia cautioned. If it's conscious, it will sense your approach. Dan moved slowly, methodically, his training taking over. As he rounded the formation, he finally caught sight of the creature and froze. Partially trapped beneath fallen rocks lay a being unlike anything he'd seen before. It resembled the Vorhan images he'd studied, with a skeletal, predatory build and sharp spines along its back. But there were differences too. Its hide was a mottled gray, rather than the reddish-brown of typical Vorhans, and its proportions seemed slightly off. Most notably, a large wound disfigured its back, the flesh appearing melted or dissolved. The creature's breathing was labored, one front limb clearly pinned beneath the rocks. Visual contact established, Dan whispered into his comm. It's similar to Vorhan morphology, but with distinct variations. Badly injured, partially trapped. Can you confirm it's incapacitated? Corvin demanded. As if in answer to the question, the creature's eyes suddenly snapped open, startling yellow orbs with vertical pupils that fixed immediately on Dan. A low, rumbling growl emanated from its throat. Dan froze, his heart pounding. This was the moment of truth, when theory met reality. Slowly, deliberately, he reached for the tranquilizer gun. It's awake, he reported, keeping his voice calm, but weakened. I'm proceeding with tranquilization. The creature's growl intensified, its free limbs straining to move. But it was too weakened by injury and entrapment to pose an immediate threat. Dan aimed carefully, targeting the thickest part of the creature's haunch, where the tranquilizer would be most effective. Easy now, he murmured, though he knew the creature couldn't understand him. The familiar words were more for his own benefit, a ritual that had served him well over years of working with dangerous animals. The tranquilizer fired with a soft hiss. The dart struck true, embedding in the creature's flank. The yellow eyes widened, then narrowed in rage. For a moment, Dan feared the dosage might be insufficient. The creature thrashed with surprising strength, its claws gouging deep furrows in the stone. Then, gradually, its movement slowed. The fearsome growl faded to a rumble, then silence. The yellow eyes glazed over as consciousness fled. Dan exhaled slowly. Subject is tranquilized, moving in to assess injuries. Up close, the differences from a standard Vorhan were even more apparent. Though it shared the basic predatory structure, powerful limbs, sharp claws, a mouth full of razor-like teeth, its bone structure was more compact, its hide less leathery. Most curiously, patches of what almost looked like soft fur grew between the spines on its back. This isn't a pure Vorhan, Dan reported as he scanned the creature. The genetic markers are similar, but there are significant variations. I'm transmitting the scan data now. He worked quickly to treat the worst of the creature's injuries, applying synthetic skin to the caustic burn on its back and carefully extracting the trapped limb from beneath the rocks. Remarkably, the limb wasn't broken, just badly bruised. Injuries are severe but treatable, he concluded. I am preparing for transport back to the landing craft. Specialist Reyes. Captain Tanako's voice was tight with concern. Are you certain this is wise? Even if it's not a pure Vorhan, it clearly shares predatory characteristics. With respect, Captain, this is what I was brought aboard to do. Study and understand alien biology. This creature represents a significant scientific opportunity. Dan began preparing a hover stretcher for transport. Plus, it's sedated and will remain so until safely contained aboard the Aurora. There was a pause, then a sigh. Proceed with extraction. But be advised, the creature will be placed in maximum security containment upon arrival. Transporting the sedated creature back to the landing craft proved challenging in the planet's harsh conditions. A dust storm was brewing, reducing visibility to mere meters. The hover stretcher struggled against the increasingly powerful gusts, requiring Dan to manually stabilize it multiple times. Halfway to the landing craft, disaster struck. The creature's metabolism, different from standard Vorhan physiology, processed the tranquilizer faster than anticipated. Its yellow eyes fluttered open, momentarily disoriented, then locked onto Dan with predatory focus. "It's waking up," Dan reported urgently, reaching for the secondary tranquilizer. "Earlier than expected." Before he could administer another dose, the creature lunged upward with surprising strength, nearly toppling from the hover stretcher. Dan barely avoided a swipe of its clawed limb, the razor-sharp appendage missing his environmental suit by centimeters. "Abort mission!" Corvin's voice thundered through the comm. "Return to the ship immediately!" Dan ignored the order, focusing entirely on the creature before him. It was weakened, confused, acting on instinct rather than calculated aggression. He'd seen this behavior countless times in injured predators, moving with the calm, deliberate motions that had saved his life many times before. Dan spoke in low, even tones while preparing the secondary tranquilizer. "Easy now. You're hurt. I'm trying to help." The creature paused, its head tilting slightly, as if attempting to process the strange sounds. In that moment of hesitation, Dan administered the second dose. This time, he had calibrated it more precisely for the creature's unique metabolism. Within seconds, the yellow eyes clouded once more. The creature slumped back onto the hover stretcher, unconscious again. "Subject resedated," Dan reported, his voice steady despite his pounding heart. "Resuming transport to landing craft." "That was reckless and insubordinate," Captain Tanaka replied. But there was a note of reluctant respect in her voice. "Complete the extraction quickly. The storm is intensifying." By the time Dan reached the landing craft with his unconscious cargo, the dust storm had developed into a full-blown tempest. Visibility was near zero, sand particles pinging against the craft's hull like tiny bullets. The takeoff was rough, the small vessel buffeted mercilessly by crosswinds as it clawed its way back into orbit. Throughout the ascent, Dan monitored the creature's vital signs, adjusting the sedation as needed. Its metabolism was fascinating. Periods of extreme energy expenditure, followed by near hibernation states. No wonder it had processed the initial tranquilizer so quickly. As the landing craft approached the Aurora, Dan could sense the tension waiting for him. The comm channels had been unnervingly silent since his refusal to abort the mission. The landing bay was fully staffed when he arrived. Not just the usual technical crew, but a full security detail led by Corvin, weapons prominently displayed. Captain Tanaka stood slightly apart, her expression unreadable. "Specialist Reyes," she said as Dan emerged from the landing craft. "You disobeyed a direct order." Dan nodded, not attempting to deny it. "I made a judgment call based on my expertise. The subject was retrievable, and the scientific value—" "Save it," Corvin interrupted. "Where's the beast?" "Still sedated in the craft," Dan replied. "It needs immediate medical attention for the caustic burn on its back." Zalia stepped forward, medical scanner in hand. "I'll assess its condition, but it goes directly to high-security containment afterward." Captain Tanaka nodded her agreement. "Security will transport it. You've taken enough risks for one day, specialist." Dan wanted to protest. He knew how to handle the creature better than anyone, but recognized he'd pushed his authority to its limit already. "Understood, Captain. But may I at least observe the medical treatment? Its physiology is unique, and I've gathered valuable initial data." After a moment's consideration, Captain Tanaka nodded. "You may observe, but security protocols will be followed to the letter." What followed was a tense procession through the Aurora's corridors. The sedated creature was transferred to a reinforced hover gurney, secured with multiple restraints, despite its unconscious state. Corvin and 3 security officers surrounded it, weapons drawn, while Zalia led the way to the medical bay, her sensitive nose twitching nervously. The crew members they passed pressed themselves against the walls, staring in horror and fascination at what appeared to be a Vorhan being transported through their ship. Whispers followed in their wake. "Is that what I think it is? Has command lost their minds? Did you hear? Reyes brought it aboard himself." By the time they reached the medical bay, rumors were flying throughout the ship. Dan heard snippets as they passed. He'd fought the beast barehanded. He'd communicated with it telepathically. He was secretly working for a bioweapons division. The reality was far less dramatic, but perhaps more significant. As Zalia conducted a thorough scan of the sedated creature, her initial shock gave way to scientific curiosity. "These readings are unexpected," she murmured. Ears perked forward in concentration. "The DNA structure shares some markers with documented Vorhans, but there are substantial differences." She looked up at Dan. "You were right. This isn't a pure Vorhan." "Then, what is it?" demanded Corvin, who hadn't holstered his weapon despite the creature's secure restraints and continued sedation. "Some kind of hybrid," Zalia replied, still studying the readings. "Vorhan-based genetics, but spliced with something else. Something with more social cognitive structures." Dan moved closer to examine the creature. Now, under the medical bay's bright lights, he could see details that had been obscured on the planet's surface. The patches he'd thought were fur were indeed softer tissue, with a fine, velvety texture, unlike the leathery hide of pure Vorhans. The creature's skull structure was also slightly different, the brain case proportionally larger. "Someone engineered this," Dan said softly. "It's a deliberate creation." "But who? And why?" Captain Tanako asked. Her brow furrowed. "There's been no record of genetic experimentation with Vorhans. They're far too dangerous." "Perhaps illegal bioweapon research?" suggested Corvin darkly. "All the more reason to destroy it." "Or a failed attempt at domestication," Dan countered. "Look at these neural pathways. They're consistent with species that can form social bonds." He pointed to the scan. "This creature was designed to be trainable." Zalia nodded slowly. "The prefrontal structures do show development in areas associated with impulse control and emotional bonding in other species." "Theoretical capacity doesn't negate the danger," Corvin insisted. "Even if it was designed to be trainable, it's still primarily Vorhan, a born killer." Captain Tanako rubbed her temples, clearly weighing the competing concerns. "Dr. Zalia, what's required to treat its injuries?" "The caustic burn needs specialized treatment, likely from industrial chemicals. I can regenerate the damaged tissue, but it will take time, several days of treatment, at minimum. And it will need to remain sedated throughout?" Zalia hesitated. "Not ideal, medically speaking. Continuous sedation at this level will interfere with healing and could cause permanent damage to its neural system. So we're faced with allowing a potentially lethal predator to regain consciousness aboard this vessel," the captain summarized grimly. Dan saw his opportunity. "Captain, with your permission, I'd like to attempt controlled rehabilitation during the treatment period." The request was met with immediate protest from Corvin and skeptical looks from most of the medical staff. Only Zalia appeared thoughtful, rather than dismissive. "Explain," Captain Tanako said simply. "We keep it in high-security containment. Naturally," Dan began. "But, rather than continuous heavy sedation, we use lighter, intermittent sedation while I work with it, establish trust, begin basic training protocols. I've done this successfully with numerous Earth predators." "Earth predators aren't Vorhans," Corvin growled. "No, but the principle remains the same," Dan insisted. "All predators respond to consistent handling, clear boundaries, and positive reinforcement. And this one," he gestured to the creature, "was literally designed to be more receptive to such methods." Captain Tanako considered for a long moment, her gaze moving from the sedated creature to Dan and back again. "You truly believe this is possible?" "I do," Dan said firmly. and it represents an unprecedented opportunity to study a unique life form, one that could provide valuable insights into both Vorhan biology and advanced genetic engineering techniques. The captain's decision, when it came, pleased no one entirely. The creature would be placed in the highest security containment cell, with multiple redundant safeguards. Dan would be permitted to attempt rehabilitation, but under strict protocols. Security observation at all times, emergency sedation systems ready, and a 3-strike policy. Any 3 behaviors deemed dangerously aggressive would result in immediate termination of the project. "This is against my better judgment," she told Dan, as the security team prepared to transport the creature to containment. "Don't make me regret it." "I won't," Dan promised. "And thank you, Captain." As the creature was moved to its secure cell, Dan already began planning his approach. He would need to be present when it first regained consciousness, establish himself as a non-threat, but also as a figure of authority. Food would be crucial, finding the right nutrition to support healing while also serving as a training reward. Most importantly, he needed to name it. Names were powerful tools in establishing connection, both for the trainer and the subject. Looking at the unconscious form with its distinctive gray coloration and unique features, a name came to him naturally. "Gari," he said softly. The creature's ear twitched slightly, though it remained deeply sedated. "Your name is Gari." The first 72 hours were critical. Dan barely left the secure observation area adjacent to Gari's containment cell, catching sleep in short bursts on a makeshift cot. He was determined to be present when Gari first awakened, to immediately begin establishing a pattern of non-threatening interaction. Zalia visited regularly to treat the caustic burn, her initial wariness gradually giving way to professional curiosity. "The tissue is regenerating remarkably quickly," she noted during one treatment session. "Its healing factor exceeds both human and Vorhan norms." Dan nodded, watching Gari's vital signs on the monitor. "Another engineered trait, perhaps? Whoever created this hybrid wanted it to be resilient. Or they anticipated it would sustain frequent injuries," Corvin suggested darkly from his permanent station by the security controls. The reptilian had appointed himself chief observer, making no secret of his conviction that the project would end in disaster. Gari's first awakening was tense, but ultimately anticlimactic. The yellow eyes opened slowly, blinking in confusion at the unfamiliar surroundings. When they fixed on Dan, there was a moment of rigid alertness, then a low growl. Dan remained perfectly still, maintaining eye contact without staring aggressively. "Hello, Gari," he said softly. "You're safe here." The growl intensified. Behind him, he heard Corvin ready the emergency sedation system. "Not yet," Dan said without turning around. "This is normal territorial response. Give it time." For nearly 30 minutes, they remained in a standoff, Gari growling intermittently from its secured position in the containment cell. Dan sitting calmly just outside the transparent barrier. He spoke occasionally in the same soft, even tone, using Gari's name frequently to create association. Gradually, the growling subsided. Exhaustion from injury and the lingering effects of sedation took their toll, and Gari's eyelids began to droop. Just before the creature drifted back to sleep, Dan noted with satisfaction that its posture had relaxed slightly, the first tiny victory. Over the next 2 weeks, Dan established a careful routine. He was present for all of Gari's waking periods, which grew longer as the creature's strength returned. Each session began the same way: calm greeting, respectful distance, no sudden movements. Food was introduced slowly, first simply left in the cell, then offered more directly as Gari became accustomed to Dan's presence. The breakthrough came unexpectedly on the 16th day. Dan had brought a simple training tool, a reinforced ball designed to withstand powerful jaws. When he rolled it into the cell, Gary's reaction was not the aggression or indifference Dan had anticipated, but rather intense curiosity. The creature sniffed the ball cautiously, then batted it experimentally with one clawed limb. "Good," Dan encouraged quietly. "That's good, Gary." To everyone's astonishment, Gary picked up the ball in its mouth and carried it to the transparent barrier, separating it from Dan. After a moment's hesitation, it dropped the ball and pushed it forward with its nose, a clear offering. Dan heard Zalia's sharp intake of breath from where she stood monitoring the medical readings. Even Corvin was momentarily speechless. "That's play behavior," Dan said, unable to keep the excitement from his voice. "Spontaneous social play behavior? Impossible," Corvin muttered. "Forehands don't play. They kill." "But Gary isn't just a Vorhan," Dan reminded him, carefully retrieving the ball through the small transfer portal in the barrier. "And this confirms what I suspected about the hybrid design: enhanced social cognition." When he rolled the ball back into the cell, Gary's reaction was unmistakable, a full body wiggle of excitement before pouncing on the toy. The subsequent game of back and forth lasted nearly 20 minutes, witnessed by an ever-growing audience of crew members who had heard rumors of the tame Vorhan and come to see for themselves. Captain Tanako arrived as the session was concluding, observing with undisguised amazement as Gary responded to Dan's simple commands, sitting when instructed, waiting patiently for the ball to be returned. "Remarkable," she acknowledged. "I wouldn't have believed it possible if I wasn't seeing it with my own eyes." "This is just the beginning," Dan told her, unable to suppress his pride in Gary's progress. "With continued work, I believe Gary could be safely integrated into less restrictive environments. The containment cell is limiting our ability to assess full mobility and social capabilities." The captain raised an eyebrow. "You want to let it out?" "Not unrestricted," Dan clarified quickly. "But perhaps access to the secure exercise yard under controlled conditions. It would allow for more comprehensive training and better physical rehabilitation." Captain Tanako considered the request thoughtfully. "The security protocols remain in place. Any 3 aggressive incidents, and the project is terminated. But yes, you may begin limited supervised sessions in the exercise yard, provided all safety measures are in place." The news spread quickly throughout the ship. The prospect of a tamed Vorhan moving about the vessel, even in a controlled environment, generated intense speculation and concern. Some crew members petitioned for additional security measures. Others expressed curiosity and cautious support for the rehabilitation project. Corvin redoubled his vigilance, personally inspecting the exercise yard security systems and insisting on additional armed guards during Gary's first session outside the containment cell. "One wrong move," he warned Dan, "and I won't hesitate." Dan understood the security officer's concerns, but remained confident in Gary's progress. The hybrid had shown remarkable adaptability and intelligence during their training sessions, learning commands quickly and showing increasing comfort with human presence. The first venture into the exercise yard was scheduled during a low-activity period to minimize disruption and risk. Dan entered Gary's cell alone, equipped with a specialized harness designed for the creature's unique physiology. "Good morning, Gary," he said warmly. "Today's going to be different. We're going for a walk." Gary, now fully recovered from its injuries, stood alert but calm as Dan approached with the harness. When he held it out, Gary sniffed it curiously. Then, to Dan's delight, lowered its head to allow the equipment to be fitted, a tremendous display of trust. The small procession that emerged from the containment area drew stares from everyone they passed. Dan walked confidently at Gary's side, one hand resting lightly on the harness. Corvin and 2 security officers followed at a short distance, weapons at the ready, but not raised. Gary moved with a fluid grace that had been impossible to appreciate in the confined space of the cell. Its powerful limbs carried it in a smooth, loping gait that spoke of tremendous strength and agility. Yet there was no aggression in its demeanor, only alert curiosity as it took in the new sights, sounds, and smells of the ship's corridors. The exercise yard, originally designed for crew physical training but repurposed for Gauri's rehabilitation, was a spacious area with reinforced walls and multiple security features. As the doors sealed behind them, Dan removed the harness, allowing Gauri complete freedom of movement for the first time since its rescue. What followed was a joyous display of physical prowess. Gauri bounded around the perimeter of the yard, leaping to impressive heights, testing its strength against various training obstacles. The sheer power of the creature was breathtaking and sobering, a reminder of the potential danger it represented, if not properly managed. Yet there was also undeniable intelligence in its movements. Gauri wasn't simply running wild. It was systematically exploring the space, investigating each feature, occasionally looking back at Dan as if seeking approval or guidance. "Remarkable spatial awareness," commented Zalia, who had joined the observation team. "And the social checking behavior. That's typically only seen in pack species with complex hierarchies." Dan nodded, watching as Gauri completed its circuit of the yard and trotted back to where he stood. Further evidence that this hybrid was engineered for enhanced social cognition. Gauri wants to connect, to be part of a social structure. "Or it's lulling us into a false sense of security," Corvin muttered, but there was less conviction in his voice than usual. Even he couldn't deny the non-aggressive nature of Gauri's behavior. The exercise sessions became a regular part of Gauri's rehabilitation program, gradually increasing in duration and complexity. Dan introduced new training elements with each session: obstacle courses, tracking exercises, simple problem-solving tasks. Gauri's intelligence proved to be exceptional, mastering new challenges with minimal repetition. More surprising was the creature's growing relationship with the ship's crew. Initially, only Dan was permitted in the exercise yard with Gauri. But as confidence in the hybrid's behavior grew, carefully selected crew members were allowed limited interaction under Dan's supervision. Zalia was the first, her medical expertise making her the logical choice to assess Gauri's physical recovery up close. Despite her initial nervousness, she quickly developed a rapport with the creature, who seemed particularly gentle around the diminutive medical officer. "Its heart rate actually decreases in your presence," she told Dan with amazement after one session. "A clear physiological indicator of comfort and trust." Even some of the engineering crew eventually participated, after Gauri demonstrated an unexpected talent during a routine maintenance issue. A coolant leak had developed in a section of the ship near the exercise yard, its distinctive chemical signature too subtle for the sensors to pinpoint, but potentially dangerous if left unaddressed. During an exercise session, Gauri had suddenly become alert, focusing intently on a specific section of wall. Despite there being no visible indication of a problem, the hybrid had pawed at the area persistently, making soft vocalizations that Dan recognized as signs of concern. When engineers investigated, they discovered a hairline fracture in a coolant conduit, exactly where Gauri had indicated. The creature's enhanced senses had detected what advanced technology had missed. "Could be coincidence," Corvin had insisted, but his objections were growing perfunctory. The evidence of Gauri's beneficial presence was becoming difficult to ignore. Only one shadow loomed over the otherwise successful rehabilitation project: the mystery of Gauri's origins. Despite extensive database searches, no record could be found of any authorized genetic experimentation combining Vorhan DNA with other species. The level of sophistication in Gauri's engineering suggested advanced facilities and expertise, yet no research institution claimed responsibility. "It's troubling," Captain Tanako admitted during a project review meeting. "If someone is conducting unsanctioned genetic engineering of predatory species, the potential security implications are significant." "Could Gauri have been a prototype for some kind of biological weapon?" Zalia suggested hesitantly. The Vorhan aggression combined with enhanced intelligence and trainability. Dan shook his head firmly. Gari's design speaks to domestication, not weaponization. The enhanced social cognition, the play behaviors, the capacity for bonding. These aren't traits you'd engineer into a weapon. Unless the weapon was meant to infiltrate before attacking, Corvin pointed out. A predator that gains trust before striking. The unsettling discussion was interrupted by a ship-wide alert. Captain Tanaka was immediately called to the bridge, the rehabilitation team following close behind. We've received a distress signal from Research Outpost Xenon 7, the communications officer reported as they arrived. They're under attack. Hostile forces? Captain Tanaka asked sharply. Negative. Captain. Wildlife. The officer's voice was grim. A pack of Vorhans has surrounded the outpost. 2 researchers are already dead, and the remaining team is barricaded in the central lab with failing defenses. A chill swept through the bridge. Everyone present knew the ferocity of Vorhan attacks, coordinated, relentless, and nearly impossible to repel without significant firepower. Set course immediately, the captain ordered. Maximum speed. Prepare security teams for ground intervention. Dan's mind was racing. This was a Vorhan pack, real Vorhans, not hybrids like Gari. Yet the coincidence was striking. Could there be a connection between Gari's engineered existence and this sudden Vorhan aggression? Captain, he said, an idea forming. I'd like to join the ground team. Captain Tanaka looked at him skeptically. This isn't a rehabilitation situation. Specialist Reyes. These are wild Vorhans in the middle of a killing spree. I understand that. But Gari shares Vorhan DNA. There may be communication possibilities we haven't explored. Dan knew it was a long shot, but the potential to save lives outweighed the risk. Gari has demonstrated exceptional sensory capabilities and intelligence. At minimum, those traits could be valuable in a rescue operation. The captain's expression made it clear she thought the suggestion bordered on madness. You want to bring your pet into an active Vorhan attack situation? Put that way, it did sound absurd, but Dan was committed to the idea. I believe there's a possibility Gari could help defuse the situation without bloodshed, either through communication with the wild Vorhans or through some other application of its unique abilities. A heated debate ensued, with Corvin predictably arguing vehemently against the proposal. Surprisingly, Zalia offered qualified support. From a biological perspective, there is precedent for interspecies communication based on shared genetic markers, she noted. And Gari's enhanced senses could provide tactical advantages in the field. In the end, the decision came down to a grim calculus of risk versus potential benefit. The outpost researchers were in imminent danger. Conventional rescue operations against Vorhans historically resulted in additional casualties, and time was running out. Against my better judgment, again, I'm approving this, Captain Tanaka finally declared. But, Specialist Reyes, you will follow security protocols to the letter. Gari remains restrained at all times, and at the first sign that its presence is exacerbating rather than helping the situation, you will withdraw immediately. The journey to Xenon 7 was tense, while the security team prepared weapons and tactical plans. Dan worked with Gari in the exercise yard, reinforcing basic commands and introducing new scent samples collected from previous Vorhan encounters. Gari seemed to recognize the scents immediately, responding with alert attention but not aggression, a promising sign. Dan also introduced a specialized harness that would allow for greater control in the field, while still permitting Gari the movement necessary to communicate with its wild counterparts, if such communication proved possible. As the Aurora approached Xenon 7, the situation at the research outpost had deteriorated further. The Vorhan pack, numbering at least 12 individuals, had breached the outpost's outer defenses. The surviving researchers were now confined to a single reinforced laboratory with dwindling power reserves for the security shields. The landing site selected was approximately half a kilometer from the outpost, close enough for rapid deployment, but distant enough to avoid immediately drawing the Vorhan's attention. As the security team made final preparations, Dan knelt beside Gari, who was fully harnessed and alert. "This is it," he said softly, looking into those intelligent yellow eyes. "I'm trusting you, and I need you to trust me. We're going to help those people." Gari made a soft, trilling sound, a vocalization Dan had come to associate with attention and affirmation. It wasn't imagination. He was certain, in that moment, Gari understood the gravity of what they were about to attempt. The planet's surface was unlike Athera IV, lush vegetation rather than barren desert, with dense foliage that limited visibility but provided potential cover. The security team moved in tight formation, weapons ready, with Dan and Gari in a protected position at the center. Corvin, leading the advance, halted suddenly and raised a closed fist, the signal to stop. "Movement ahead," he whispered. "Single Vorhan, likely a scout." Dan felt Gari tense beside him. The hybrid's attention locked on the direction Corvin had indicated. Unlike the security team's weapons, Gari's senses weren't hindered by the dense vegetation. "Gari sees it," Dan confirmed softly. "No aggressive posture yet. Just alert." Corvin nodded grimly. "We need to neutralize it before it alerts the pack." Dan laid a restraining hand on the security officer's arm. "Wait. Let me try something first." Before Corvin could object, Dan gave Gari a specific hand signal, one they had practiced extensively during training sessions. "Communicate," he whispered, loosening his grip on the harness slightly. Gari stepped forward, still within Dan's control but now visible to the Vorhan scout. For a tense moment, nothing happened. Then Gari made a series of soft vocalizations, complex sounds unlike anything Dan had heard during their training sessions. The response was immediate. The Vorhan scout emerged from the underbrush, a creature similar to Gari in basic structure, but more ragged, with the reddish-brown coloration typical of pure Vorhans. It regarded Gari with unmistakable wariness, head lowered in what appeared to be a defensive posture. "Don't move," Dan breathed to the security team. "Something's happening." The exchange that followed defied conventional understanding of Vorhan behavior. Gari and the scout engaged in what could only be described as communication, a combination of vocalizations, body postures, and subtle movements that seemed to convey complex information. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, the scout made a guttural sound and retreated into the vegetation. "What just happened?" Corvin demanded, weapons still trained on the spot where the Vorhan had disappeared. "I think Gari just negotiated safe passage," Dan said, amazed. "The scout didn't alert the pack, didn't attack. It's letting us approach." "Or leading us into a trap," Corvin countered. But he nevertheless signaled the team to continue advancing, albeit with heightened caution. As they neared the research outpost, the evidence of the Vorhan attack became grimly apparent. The outer perimeter fencing had been torn apart, equipment lay scattered and destroyed, and the remains of automated defense turrets were little more than twisted metal. Most disturbing were the two bodies they discovered, researchers who had been caught outside when the attack began. The Vorhan pack hadn't simply killed them. They had been torn apart with methodical savagery. Corvin gave Dan a pointed look. "Still, think communication is possible with creatures that do this?" Dan had no answer. The brutality of the scene was undeniable. Yet Gari's exchange with the scout suggested possibilities beyond simple aggression. The hybrid remained alert, but calm at his side, showing none of the frenzy that might be expected if it shared the wild Vorhan's bloodlust. The main pack came into view as they approached the central laboratory building, a dozen powerful forms prowling around the structure, occasionally hurling themselves against the energy shields that still protected the entrance. The shields flickered with each impact, the power supply clearly failing. We need to draw them away from the building, Corvin decided. Create a diversion, then get the researchers out through the rear access. Before they could implement this plan, Gari suddenly stiffened, ears perked forward. A low, resonant sound emerged from its throat. Not a growl, but a deep, thrumming call that carried across the clearing. Every Vorhan in the pack froze, heads swiveling toward the sound. Corvin cursed, raising his weapon, certain they had lost the element of surprise. But what happened next astonished everyone. Instead of charging their position, the Vorhan pack remained still, watching as Gari stepped forward to the edge of the clearing. Dan moved with the hybrid, maintaining contact with the harness, while allowing Gari to take the lead. The pack's reaction was unlike anything documented in Vorhan behavior. They arranged themselves in a semicircle, maintaining distance, their postures neither aggressive nor submissive, but watchful. The largest Vorhan, presumably the pack leader, moved slightly ahead of the others, its scarred face and powerful build marking it as a formidable opponent. Gari made that resonant thrumming sound again, then added a series of shorter vocalizations. The pack leader responded with a similar pattern, though harsher and more guttural. "They're communicating," Zalia whispered in awe. "Actual structured communication." For several tense minutes, the exchange continued. Gari and the pack leader engaged in what appeared to be a complex negotiation, while the rest of the pack and the security team watched in wary silence. Then, something remarkable happened. Gari performed a specific movement, lowering its head and front limbs in a deliberate posture before the pack leader. The wild Vorhan studied this display, then made a sharp barking sound to the rest of the pack. As one, the Vorhans backed away from the laboratory building. They didn't flee. Rather, they moved to the perimeter of the clearing, maintaining their semicircle formation, but no longer threatening the structure or the rescue team. "I don't believe what I'm seeing," Corvin muttered, weapon still raised but expression confused. "Are they standing down?" "Not exactly," Dan replied, observing the subtle dynamics at play. "They're acknowledging Gari's authority, or at least agreeing to temporary coexistence. This is unprecedented." With the immediate threat neutralized, the rescue operation proceeded with surreal ease. The researchers were evacuated from the laboratory, casting terrified glances at the ring of Vorhans that watched but made no move to attack. Medical attention was provided to the injured, and preparations began for transport back to the landing site. Throughout the operation, Gari remained at the front line, maintaining whatever unspoken agreement had been reached with the wild pack. Only when the last researcher was safely away from the building did Dan give the signal to withdraw. As they departed, the pack leader made one final vocalization, a sound that seemed to carry meaning beyond simple animal communication. Gari responded in kind, then turned to follow Dan back toward the landing craft. The Vorhan pack dispersed into the surrounding vegetation, disappearing as silently as shadows. The journey back to the Aurora was subdued, the security team and rescued researchers still processing the extraordinary events they had witnessed. Gari remained calm throughout the return trip, occasionally seeking contact with Dan as if to confirm its actions had been appropriate. In the debriefing that followed, Captain Tanako listened with growing amazement as Dan, Corvin, and the security team recounted what had transpired. "You're telling me that this hybrid, this Gari, actually communicated with wild Vorhans and prevented a massacre?" Her tone suggested she was having difficulty accepting the report, despite the multiple witnesses. "That's exactly what happened, Captain," Corvin confirmed, his previous skepticism noticeably diminished. "I've encountered Vorhans before. They don't negotiate. They don't back down. What we saw today defies everything we know about their behavior. Or reveals how little we truly understood," Dan suggested. "Gari's ability to communicate suggests that Vorhan social structures may be more complex than we realized." The hybrid engineering enhanced these latent capabilities, made them more accessible. Zalia, who had been analyzing the recorded data from the encounter, looked up from her terminal. The vocalizations contained distinct patterns, repeated sounds in specific sequences. It's primitive, but it has the structural elements of actual language. The implications were staggering. If Vorhans possessed even rudimentary language capabilities, it fundamentally changed their classification from simple predators to potentially sentient beings with complex social structures. This discovery extends far beyond a single hybrid specimen, Captain Tanaka mused. It could transform our understanding of xenobiology and our protocols for interacting with predatory species. In the days that followed, Gari's status aboard the Aurora underwent a dramatic shift. The security protocols remained in place as a precaution, but the hybrid was no longer viewed as a dangerous experiment. Crew members, who had once avoided the exercise yard, now sought opportunities to observe Gari's training sessions, fascinated by the intelligence and social capabilities the creature displayed. Corvin, perhaps the most surprising convert, requested permission to participate in some of the training exercises. "Know your potential adversaries," he explained, when Dan expressed surprise. "Though I'm beginning to think adversary may not be the right classification anymore." 3 months after the rescue from Athera IV, Captain Tanaka made the arrangement official. During a shipwide address, she announced, "In recognition of unique capabilities and service to this vessel, Specimen GR7, known as Gari, is hereby classified as the Aurora's first interplanetary companion animal." The designation was unprecedented, a formal acknowledgement that Gari was neither experimental subject nor potential threat, but a valued member of the ship's complement with specific roles and responsibilities. For Dan, the announcement represented the culmination of a belief he had held throughout his career. That understanding could overcome fear, that connection was possible across the boundaries of species and worlds. As he watched Gari interact confidently with crew members who had once called for its destruction, he felt a profound sense of vindication. Yet, questions remained. Gari's origins were still a mystery. Who had created this remarkable hybrid? And for what purpose? The sophistication of the genetic engineering suggested resources and expertise beyond typical rogue operations. Someone, somewhere, had developed the science of Vorhan domestication to an advanced degree. And perhaps more importantly, what did Gari's existence and abilities suggest about the future of interspecies relations? If a creature derived from the galaxy's most feared predator could become a trusted companion, what other possibilities awaited discovery? These questions would guide the Aurora's mission in the months to come. But for now, as Dan watched Gari demonstrating its scenting abilities for an appreciative audience of engineers, he was content with what they had already achieved. From feared predator to beloved companion, the journey had transformed not just Gari, but everyone who had witnessed it. And in that transformation lay the promise of a future where understanding replaced fear, where differences became strengths, and where the boundaries between species dissolved in the face of connection. Captain Tanaka approached Dan as the demonstration concluded. Gari, trotting proudly at his side with a training tool clutched carefully in its jaws. "Specialist Reyes," she said with a smile that had become increasingly common. "In light of recent events, I'm creating a new position aboard the Aurora, Interspecies Relations Officer. I can think of no one better qualified to fill it." Dan looked down at Gari, who gazed back with intelligent yellow eyes that seemed to understand the significance of the moment. "We'd be honored, Captain. Both of us." Gari made that soft, trilling sound of affirmation, dropping the training tool at the captain's feet in what could only be described as a gesture of respect. Captain Tanaka laughed, a sound rarely heard on the bridge, and bent to retrieve the offering. "I believe this is the beginning of a new chapter in space exploration," she said. One where we learn as much from the beings we encounter as they learn from us. As the Aurora continued its journey among the stars, Gari padded silently alongside its human companion. No longer a monster from nightmare, but a bridge between worlds. Living proof that even the most feared predator could become the most unexpected friend.